A significant severe weather threat is beginning to take shape, and forecasters are increasingly concerned that it could include the potential for a strong tornado at some point over the coming days. Starting today, two distinct zones of severe weather are becoming active, with thunderstorms developing across the Midwest and the northern plains. These storms are expected to bring damaging winds, large hail, and isolated tornadoes, with the overall threat area shifting eastward tomorrow, stretching from Illinois into Pennsylvania. But the story does not end there. By the middle of the week, this threat is expected to become considerably more widespread, as a stalled frontal boundary sets up what looks like a prolonged and potentially dangerous flash flood threat across the Ohio Valley. At the same time, a large zone of heat is expected to expand into the plains in the southeast, while activity in the Atlantic tropics begins to stir. All told, the weather pattern over the next several days is shaping up to be an unusually active one. The severe weather potential for today, Sunday, is considerable. The Storm Prediction Center has outlined a large slight risk of severe weather stretching from southern Minnesota into Chicago and even as far as northwest Ohio. A second slight risk area has also been drawn across the Dakotas, and a broader marginal risk of severe weather extends from Pennsylvania all the way back into Montana, where all modes of severe weather are considered possible today. The primary concern for today is damaging wind gusts, which are expected to be a factor throughout the morning and into the afternoon hours. There is even a possibility that a corridor of especially intense wind could line up across South Dakota, where gusts exceeding 75 to 80 miles per hour cannot be ruled out this afternoon. Given that risk, it is important today to secure or protect any loose outdoor items that could become dangerous projectiles in such winds. There is also a risk of large to very large hail today, particularly across North Dakota and South Dakota, where hail up to baseball size is considered possible. Interestingly, the shape of today's hail risk area on the Outlook map resembles something like a glass slipper stretching across the northern tier of the country, an unusual but notable visual detail in an otherwise serious setup. Beyond wind and hail, there's also a tornado threat in play today. Although the tornado probability itself is listed at only 2%, this area does encompass a fairly significant population base. More importantly, there is real concern that if the right ingredients come together, a strong tornado, potentially EF2 or greater, could develop this afternoon. The central challenge with today's setup is timing and evolution. A round of thunderstorms expected this morning could stabilize the atmosphere heading into the afternoon, but any leftover boundary from that activity could become a focal point for a supercell to develop later in the day. If that happens, the environment includes a substantial amount of wind shear, which would meaningfully raise the risk of a significant tornado forming this afternoon or evening. For residents of northern Illinois, northern Indiana, and southern Michigan in particular, today is a day to remain weather aware and to have multiple reliable ways of receiving warnings, given the uncertainty in exactly how the atmosphere will behave. Moving into Monday, the area of concern shifts to the south and east. Once again, a slight risk of severe weather has been outlined, this time stretching from Springfield, Illinois, into far western Pennsylvania, near Pittsburgh, with a broader marginal risk extending from Philadelphia and New York City back across to Nebraska and South Dakota. The primary concern for Monday remains damaging wind gusts. There's also a chance of some large hail developing across the Central Plains. In addition, another low-end tornado threat is expected to be in play, covering areas from Peoria back into Champaign, as well as Canton, Cleveland, Columbus, and Fort Wayne. All of these locations fall under at least a low-end tornado risk for Monday. By Tuesday, the area of concern grows even larger. A substantial risk zone for severe weather is expected to stretch all the way from South Dakota and North Dakota back into Richmond and Norfolk, Virginia. This particular threat looks to be driven mainly by damaging winds, though a tornado threat cannot be ruled out either. In addition to the severe weather risk, an increasing flash flooding threat is expected to develop Monday night into Tuesday, and this flooding concern could persist through Wednesday and even into Thursday across the Ohio Valley. Looking more closely at the timing over the next several days, today's setup begins with a relatively weak line of thunderstorms expected to move across Wisconsin, Iowa, and Illinois during the morning hours and into the early afternoon. The main concern with this initial line is straight-line damaging wind gusts, though an isolated tornado cannot be ruled out over the next several hours. Areas around Milwaukee and Chicago should stay alert for the possibility of both damaging winds and a brief tornado during this window. As the day progresses into the afternoon, this line of thunderstorms is expected to weaken as it pushes into Michigan, though it could still be capable of producing gusty winds strong enough to knock out power in isolated locations. The bigger uncertainty for today revolves around what happens later in the afternoon and evening. There is a real possibility that discrete supercell thunderstorms could develop after roughly 6 p.m. in the vicinity of Chicago. Should that occur, these storms would be capable of rotating and could pose a significant tornado threat to the area. This concern is rooted in the amount of wind shear present in the atmosphere today. Various instability and shear parameters, such as significant tornado parameter values, suggest that if a supercell were able to form as a discrete cell, it would be operating in a fairly favorable environment for tornado development. If supercells do not materialize, the more likely outcome is a continuation of damaging wind gusts, along with an increasing risk of flash flooding, since any storms that do form are not expected to move very quickly. Slow-moving storms tend to dump heavier rainfall over the same locations, which raises flooding concerns independent of the tornado question. Later in the overnight hours, a broader line of thunderstorms is expected to develop, and this line will likely continue to carry the risk of significant damaging wind gusts as it moves through. It's worth noting that there is genuine model disagreement about how the evening will play out. One higher resolution model run showed very little activity developing near Chicago this evening, essentially describing a much quieter scenario than the one described above. In other words, there are two fairly different possible outcomes on the table. Either supercells develop and bring an elevated tornado risk, or activity stays minimal until overnight, at which point any storms that do form would mostly be occurring in an elevated, non-surface-based environment. Whatever ends up happening tonight and into early Monday morning will have a direct influence on how Monday and Tuesday evolve across the Midwest, Ohio Valley, and Northeast. Monday's forecast depends heavily on how tonight's thunderstorm activity evolves. If a weak line of storms survives overnight, it could bring some straight-line wind impacts to Pennsylvania and Ohio during the morning hours. Regardless of what happens with any leftover activity, a new round of thunderstorms is expected to develop during the mid to late afternoon and evening, focused generally just east of Indianapolis and extending toward Columbus and Cincinnati. This new development is expected to be explosive in nature, with the potential for extreme downburst-driven damaging wind gusts, some large hail, and possibly an isolated tornado. Once these storms mature, they are expected to cluster together and track eastward over the Appalachian Mountains. Overnight Monday into Tuesday morning, model guidance suggests the possibility of 2 additional clusters of thunderstorms developing across the Ohio Valley. If this scenario unfolds, it would raise the risk of flash flooding occurring alongside isolated severe weather. At the same time, another line of thunderstorms could move across Iowa and Minnesota during the same overnight period, potentially bringing additional damaging wind gusts to that region. This same overnight activity could also organize into a fairly powerful line of thunderstorms by Tuesday afternoon, which lines up closely with the broad severe weather risk area already outlined by forecasters, the zone stretching from near Chicago all the way back toward Virginia. If this line does organize as expected, damaging winds would likely be the primary hazard on Tuesday. One of the more important threads running through this entire forecast period is the potential for storms to repeatedly track over the same areas, particularly across Indiana, Ohio, and Illinois, moving from northwest to southeast in overlapping fashion. This kind of repeated training of storms over the same corridor is exactly the scenario that tends to produce dangerous, life-threatening flash flooding, even when no single storm produces an extreme amount of rain in a short window. The concern is less about any one storm and more about the cumulative effect of storm after storm tracking over the same communities. Model rainfall projections through Wednesday night show considerable amounts of rain piling up in various models, with many localized areas potentially seeing anywhere from 5 to 10 inches of rain, and some spots possibly exceeding a foot of total rainfall. That said, there is meaningful uncertainty and variability between model runs about exactly where the heaviest rainfall corridor will end up setting up. For comparison, an earlier model run had shown the highest rainfall totals landing near Cleveland, while a more recent run showed only around an inch of rain in that same area, underscoring just how much uncertainty remains in pinpointing the exact location of the worst flooding. There's also a more immediate flooding concern for tonight, specifically in the Chicago area, including communities like Aurora, Joliet, and DeKalb. Multiple models have hinted at the possibility of significant flooding developing in that corridor tonight. If thunderstorms do develop in this area, as some models suggest, there would be a tornado risk associated with them, but the larger concern would likely be flash flooding, since storms are expected to be slow-moving and to develop and repeatedly track from north to south, causing repeated overlap in the same locations. This is not considered a certainty, but residents in and around the Chicago area, especially anyone traveling tonight, are encouraged to stay alert given the possibility. The active pattern is not expected to wrap up after Tuesday. On Wednesday, another round of severe weather is expected across the Ohio Valley, with damaging wind gusts, hail, and potentially a couple of tornadoes all on the table once again. By Thursday, a shortwave trough is expected to move across the Rockies, which could spark additional severe weather. However, there remains significant uncertainty about exactly where this activity will set up. Friday and Saturday remain considerably less certain at this point. One global model has been hinting at a low-pressure system tracking across the northern plains. In earlier forecast cycles, that system appeared more likely to track into the Midwest, but more recent guidance suggests it may end up staying farther north. As a result, my confidence in exactly what will happen during this window is limited, though residents in the Midwest are encouraged to stay aware heading into the weekend, as at least a low-end severe weather threat remains possible on Saturday and Sunday. Beyond that point, there is considerable uncertainty about how the pattern evolves further. Separate from the severe weather and flooding concerns dominating the Midwest and Ohio Valley, there are early signs that the Atlantic tropics are beginning to wake up. Despite an unusually high amount of wind shear across the basin, a byproduct of the El Niño pattern currently in place, forecasters are watching for the possibility of a tropical wave developing later this week, generally in the vicinity just east of the Lesser Antilles. At this point, the system does not look particularly strong or organized. There's a second tropical wave trailing behind it that may end up being more noteworthy, though considerable uncertainty remains about its eventual strength and track as well. Neither system currently appears likely to pose a major threat to land in the near term, though that assessment could change as the week progresses. A separate model, the European model, shows a broadly similar outcome, with at least one of the two tropical waves developing, albeit in a notably weaker form. Given the level of uncertainty involved, this is a situation that will need to be monitored closely as it evolves. It is also worth noting the broader context. Hurricane season activity affecting the United States has been relatively quiet over the past couple of years. Whether that trend continues or changes this year remains to be seen, but there is a reasonable expectation that at least one hurricane will affect some part of the United States at some point this season. Taken together, the next several days feature a genuinely active and layered weather pattern. Sunday brings damaging winds, large hail with isolated baseball-sized stones, and a low probability but higher impact potential for a strong tornado, especially if a supercell develops along a leftover boundary in the Chicago region this evening. Monday sees the severe threat shift south and east, with damaging winds as the main concern, some hail in the Central Plains, and a low-end tornado risk across parts of the Midwest and Ohio Valley. Tuesday brings an expansive severe weather zone from the Dakotas to Virginia, driven mainly by damaging winds, with a tornado threat not ruled out, alongside an escalating flash flood threat. Wednesday into Thursday features continued severe weather potential across the Ohio Valley, plus a shortwave trough crossing the Rockies that could spark further severe weather in a location that remains uncertain. Friday into the weekend carries lower confidence overall, with a possible low-pressure system tracking through the northern plains, and at least a low and severe threat possible in the Midwest by Saturday and Sunday. Throughout this entire period, a serious and potentially dangerous flash flooding threat remains, tied to a stalled frontal boundary parked over the Ohio Valley, driven by repeated rounds of slow-moving overlapping thunderstorms, rather than any single extreme rainfall event. In the background, heat continues expanding across the plains and southeast, and the first stirrings of Atlantic tropical activity are being watched, with two tropical waves near the Lesser Antilles, though neither currently appears to be a near-term threat to land. Given the number of overlapping hazards, severe thunderstorms, potential strong tornadoes, large hail, and a multi-day flash flooding setup, this is shaping up to be one of the more active and consequential stretches of weather in recent memory for the affected regions. Residents across the Midwest, Ohio Valley, and Mid-Atlantic are encouraged to stay informed through the week, keep an eye on evolving forecasts, and have a reliable way to receive warnings, particularly given how much uncertainty remains in the exact placement and intensity of both the severe weather and the flooding threat. It is worth stepping back and explaining why this particular stretch of days is drawing so much attention from a forecasting standpoint. Severe weather outbreaks generally require a combination of ingredients to come together at the same time. Sufficient instability in the atmosphere to act as fuel, a trigger to get storms going such as a frontal boundary or a disturbance aloft, moisture at the surface to feed the storms, and wind shear, meaning winds that change speed and direction with height, to organize storms into rotating, longer-lived structures capable of producing significant hazards like large hail and tornadoes. Over the next several days, nearly all of these ingredients are expected to be in place at various points across the Midwest, Ohio Valley, and Northern Plains. That is part of why this outlook carries multiple days of concern, rather than just a single afternoon of storms. Rather than one clean line of thunderstorms passing through and clearing out, the pattern looks more like a series of waves, with each day's storm setting the stage through leftover boundaries, outflow, and soil moisture, for the next day's storms to intensify further. This kind of extended wave-like pattern is also precisely what tends to produce the more dangerous flooding scenarios, because it does not allow saturated ground to dry out between rounds of rain. Once soil becomes saturated, Additional rainfall runs off far more efficiently into streams, rivers, and low-lying areas, which is a major reason why the flash flooding threat outlined for the Ohio Valley later this week is being treated with such a high degree of concern despite the individual storms not necessarily being record-setting rain producers on their own. One detail worth expanding on is the distinction between the numerical probability assigned to a tornado risk and the potential intensity of any tornado that does occur. A 2% tornado risk, on its face, sounds low, and in a raw statistical sense it is. It reflects the probability of a tornado occurring within 25 miles of any given point in the outlined area. However, our probability of occurrence and potential intensity are two different things entirely. It is entirely possible for a low probability tornado setup to still carry the potential for a strong, long-track tornado if the ingredients happen to align, particularly when there is a favorable combination of instability and directional wind shear in the atmosphere. This is exactly the situation being watched for today. The presence of substantial wind shear means that if a discrete supercell thunderstorm is able to form, as opposed to storms quickly merging into a messy cluster or line, that individual storm would have access to an atmospheric environment capable of supporting rotation. This is why, even with a modest tornado probability on the outlook map, there is real concern about the potential for an intense tornado, rated EF2 or higher, if the atmosphere cooperates this afternoon or evening. Another theme worth underscoring is how much today's afternoon and evening outcome depends on what happens during the morning hours. When a round of thunderstorms moves through an area in the morning, it can have one of several effects on the atmosphere for the remainder of the day. It can stabilize the atmosphere by cooling the surface and using up available instability, which would tend to suppress future storm development. Alternatively, it can leave behind an outflow boundary, essentially a zone where cooler air near the surface, pushed out ahead of the storms, collides with the surrounding warmer, more unstable air. These leftover boundaries often become a focal point for new storm development later in the day, because the temperature and moisture contrast along the boundary can help storms initiate and can also enhance low-level rotation if a storm forms directly along it. This is part of the reasoning behind the elevated concern for the Chicago region and surrounding areas of northern Illinois, northern Indiana, and southern Michigan this evening. If the morning round of storms leaves behind a well-defined boundary and the atmosphere destabilizes enough during the afternoon, that boundary becomes a prime location for a supercell to develop, and for that supercell to potentially produce a stronger, more organized tornado than would otherwise be expected. Throughout this outlook, there are several points where different weather models disagree with one another, and it is useful to understand why that happens and what it means for the forecast. Weather models are mathematical simulations of the atmosphere, and different models use different equations, resolutions, and methods for representing physical processes like cloud formation and precipitation. As a result, it is common, especially several days out, or even within the same day when forecasting individual storm behavior, for different models to produce noticeably different solutions. This is exactly what is happening with tonight's Chicago area threat. One higher resolution short-term model run suggested that little to no thunderstorm activity would develop near Chicago this evening, essentially painting a quiet scenario. Other guidance suggests a much more active scenario, with discrete supercells possible after roughly 6 p.m. When models disagree this significantly on whether storms will even form, let alone how they will behave, it introduces a genuine binary uncertainty into the forecast. Either an active, potentially dangerous supercell scenario unfolds, or the atmosphere stays largely quiet until activity increases overnight in a more disorganized, elevated form. This same theme of model disagreement shows up again with the rainfall totals projected for later in the week. Comparing rainfall projections between different forecast cycles for the same location, in this case, the area near Cleveland, shows a dramatic swing from very heavy projected totals in an earlier run to a much lighter projected total in a more recent run. This kind of swing is common when dealing with slow-moving, disorganized rainfall events several days out, because small changes in exactly where a frontal boundary sets up, or where individual thunderstorm clusters develop and repeat, can shift projected rainfall totals by several inches in either direction. This is precisely why the flooding threat, while taken very seriously, is described with the caveat that the exact location of the heaviest rainfall corridor remains genuinely uncertain at this point. For those located within the broader threat area over the coming days, a few practical themes emerge from this outlook. Because damaging straight-line winds are a nearly constant theme across almost every single day in this forecast period, securing loose outdoor items such as patio furniture, trampolines, and umbrellas is a reasonable precaution to take proactively rather than waiting until storms are imminent. Because the tornado threat, while present on multiple days, tends to be tied to specific windows of time, such as the Sunday evening supercell scenario near Chicago, or the low-end risk stretching through Peoria, Champaign, Canton, Cleveland. At Columbus and Fort Wayne on Monday, having a reliable way to receive warnings in real time is more valuable than trying to predict the exact hour a tornado might occur. Warning systems exist precisely because atmospheric behavior, especially regarding individual supercells, can shift rapidly and unpredictably within a matter of an hour or two. Given the multi-day flash flooding setup building across the Ohio Valley, it is also worth paying attention not just to whether rain is falling, but to how much rain has already fallen in recent days, and whether additional rounds of thunderstorms are expected to track over the same areas repeatedly. Areas that have already received significant rainfall are at meaningfully higher risk for flash flooding from subsequent storms, even if those storms are not otherwise remarkable in intensity. This is particularly relevant for the Chicago suburbs, including Aurora, Joliet, and DeKalb, where flooding concerns are elevated specifically for tonight. Looking further out toward the end of the week and into the following weekend, the overall message is one of continued unsettled weather, even if the specific details remain less certain than the more immediate Sunday through Tuesday period. The shortwave trough, expected to cross the Rockies on Thursday, serves as a reminder that this active pattern is not confined to the Midwest and Ohio Valley alone. It has the potential to spark new rounds of severe weather farther west as well, even if the exact placement of that activity is not yet clear. Similarly, the potential low-pressure system that global models have been tracking across the northern plains illustrates how quickly forecast details can shift from one cycle to the next. A system that appeared likely to track into the Midwest in an earlier forecast has, in more recent guidance, shifted farther north, changing the calculus for exactly who might see additional severe weather over the coming weekend. Meanwhile, the early signs of tropical development in the Atlantic, while not an immediate threat to land, serve as an early season reminder that hurricane season is underway and that conditions, including wind shear associated with the current El Niño pattern, will play a significant role in determining how much tropical activity actually develops and how much of it, if any, eventually affects the United States. Altogether, this outlook reflects a pattern with multiple overlapping and evolving hazards: severe thunderstorms capable of large hail, damaging winds, and isolated strong tornadoes over the next several days, an increasingly serious flash flooding threat building across the Ohio Valley as the week progresses, expanding heat across the plains and southeast, and the earliest stirrings of Atlantic tropical activity that will need to be monitored as the season continues. It bears repeating that not every element of this outlook carries the same level of confidence. The Sunday through Tuesday period is described with relatively high confidence because it is close enough in time that models tend to agree more closely, and because the broad-scale pattern driving it, a stalled boundary interacting with a moist, unstable air mass, is a well-understood setup. The Wednesday and beyond portion of the outlook, by contrast, carries meaningfully lower confidence, both because it is farther out in time and because it depends on the exact evolution of the stalled boundary and the shortwave trough moving across the Rockies, both of which remain subject to change as new model data comes in. This is a normal and expected feature of extended forecasting rather than a flaw in the process. Confidence naturally increases as an event draws closer, since models have less time over which small errors can compound, and since observational data becomes more directly useful the closer an event gets. For that reason, the later portions of this outlook, particularly Thursday through the following weekend, should be treated as a general heads-up rather than a locked-in forecast, with the expectation that the details will sharpen considerably over the next several forecast cycles. In the meantime, the more immediate concerns, today's potential for a strong tornado near Chicago, tomorrow's shift of the severe threat toward the Ohio Valley and Mid-Atlantic, and Tuesday's expansive wind and flooding threat, represent the parts of this outlook where the highest level of attention and preparedness is warranted right now.